This is the third time that our center is collaborating with the World Business Council for Sustainable Development and the International Chamber of Commerce in this event series. I'm delighted to again collaborate with my dear colleagues, Davide Fiedler, Social Impact Manager at the World Business Council, and Crispin Conroy, the Representative Director of the International Chamber of Commerce here in Geneva. Crispa, let's hand over to you for a quick welcome, and then to Davide for welcome and housekeeping rules for today's event.
Great, thank you very much, Dol. I'd like to thank you and also Davide. It's a great pleasure for ICC again to be working with you, and as you say, the third of this series on key contemporary developments in the business and human rights agenda. Thank you especially to our panelists, but also to all those of you who are joining us here today. Welcome. For those of you who don't know or who are not familiar with ICC, we are the World Business Organization, the institutional representative of over 45 million companies worldwide, large and small, medium and micro. And we're engaging actively with our global network on current issues in the rapidly developing human rights and business agenda. We've been organizing a number of activities, including this series with our partners, and have recently launched an informal working group on business and human rights for our membership. From the perspective of our members, this topic, the part that voluntary collaborative initiatives can play in a mix of due diligence measures, is an important one and one of interest for many of our companies as they work to develop an effective strategy to implement the UN Guiding Principles. So I'm aware that many of our company members are participating today, so welcome especially to you, and I'm looking forward to the discussion. Thanks, Dol.
Perfect, thank you. Davide?
Yeah, thank you. My name is Davide Fiedler. I work with the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. I'm very happy to have this event today again with the Geneva Center for Business and Rights and with ICC, the third in our series, and hopefully more. For those who don't know the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, WBCSD, we're a global CEO-led organization of over 200 businesses working together to accelerate the transition to a sustainable world, and we try and help our make our members more successful by making them more sustainable and by focusing on maximizing the positive impact of business on society, on the environment, and on stakeholders in general. We have been running for a few years a business and rights project, and the event today is part of this. And we use this project to advocate for the UN Guiding Principles, to advocate for a business role that embeds the UN Guiding Principles and respect for human rights in business strategies. And we believe that robust human rights approaches and a robust human rights diligence is essential to achieve and realize the ambitions and the vision of the Sustainable Development Goals. So with that, Dorothee, back to you. I'm very happy to have this event again.
Thanks so much to both of you, Davide and Crispa. So today's theme follows directly from the discussions we had in previous sessions. Last October, we discussed the implementation of human rights in daily business practice. And in this context, the role of voluntary collaborative human rights initiatives came up. In October, corporate practitioners on the panel referred to these initiatives as indispensable for addressing human rights issues that are simply too big for any individual actor to take on alone. The practitioners highlighted that these voluntary initiatives allow them to pool expertise and resources, and they also help to benchmark their own human rights performance. This positive assessment of the role and function that voluntary initiatives have, according to many corporate practitioners, stands in stark contrast to the narrative that's currently evolving with the emerging human rights due diligence legislation in Europe. In this context, voluntary initiatives are often generally dismissed as initiatives that did not deliver on their promises. Some commentators even justify the need for mandatory regulation with the alleged failure of voluntary initiatives, I have seen this narrative strongly in German media around the preparations of the German supply chain law, but even from members of the UN Working Group for Business and Human Rights themselves. So to us, this wrongly frames the discussion over the implementation of human rights due diligence as an either-or approach. In today's session, we want to overcome this false dichotomy of voluntary and mandatory approaches and see how so-called voluntary initiatives can complement emerging mandatory human rights due diligence requirements. In my research, I've gone as far as to argue that to advance human rights in corporate practice, we need complementary voluntary initiatives that help to define what adequate human rights due diligence means in specific industry contexts. I think that some of these initiatives can make what's adequate measurable by defining industry-specific performance indicators and accountability mechanisms. And in this sense, I would say that today, some of these collaborative voluntary initiatives are more important than ever. So let me briefly get to two aspects that come up in this critical debate all the time. First is the governance structure of voluntary initiatives. I think, first of all, we need to acknowledge that these initiatives are not all created equal. As we are referring broadly to collaborative voluntary initiatives, we are actually dealing with a very wide range of what are essentially very different initiatives. In the critical debate, however, they're all clustered together, despite of the fact that they often fulfill radically different functions. And some initiatives certify products, certification schemes. Others offer platforms for exchanging expertise, roundtables. But these initiatives make no claims to regulate company behavior. The one category of initiatives that actually aims at regulating company behavior are what we in our research call human rights governance multi-stakeholder initiatives, a type that defines standards, metrics, and means of evaluation. But even in this category, there are differences. Not all multi-stakeholder initiatives that label themselves as an MSI are truly multi-stakeholder. Many have formal and informal barriers to equal participation in decision-making mechanisms. So from an academic perspective, the multi-stakeholder nature of an initiative that defines standards, metrics, and means of evaluation is certainly the condition to create a legitimate frame for private governance. These differences, to which I've now alluded to, need to be brought to light, maybe in the form of a typology of initiatives, something that my colleagues and I tried and published a few years ago. I think only if we introduce more nuance to what we're actually talking about when we refer to collaborative voluntary initiatives, we can have a meaningful debate about their role. And this brings me to the second point, namely their performance and accountability mechanisms. At this point, rather sweeping assessments are being made about the disappointing performance of many of these voluntary collaborative initiatives. But I think, first of all, many initiatives are simply not very good in communicating what they do and also what they don't do. And therefore, I look forward to hearing from the MSI representatives on the panel today what functions they aim to fulfill and what levels of accountability they offer. I think there are different standards of rigor. And I think even if in their implementation, these multi-stakeholder initiatives are imperfect, the model that they're seeking to provide can offer valuable insights into what human rights due diligence should mean in corporate practice in specific industry contexts. So with these thoughts, I've hopefully provided some input for the upcoming discussion on the role of voluntary initiatives and what role they could play in combination with mandatory human rights due diligence requirements. So please join me in warmly welcoming today's speakers on the panel, Richa Mittal from the Fair Labor Association and Sarah Dekish from the International Cocoa Initiative. Both are representing multi-stakeholder initiatives. And then we have two company representatives, companies that are part of several collaborative initiatives, Jan Wies from Nestlé and André Podlajsek from Schindler Group. Before I hand over to Davide to moderate the panel, I'd like to briefly give the word to John Grover. He's an advisor to the UN Working Group for Business and Human Rights, and today he will speak on behalf of Dante Pesco, the chair of the UN Working Group, who's sick today. John will outline how the UN Working Group sees the interplay between voluntary and mandatory due diligence. And I want to thank you for stepping in, John. And my question to you is, can we develop a smart mix of private and public regulation for business human rights, and how does the UN Working Group encourage this? John, over to you. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Doro, and thank you to you and the other co-organizers for inviting the UN Working Group chair, Dante Pesco, who regrets that he was unable to join as he's recovering from COVID. So I'm stepping in on his behalf, as you mentioned, in my capacity as advisor to the UN Working Group, and specifically to their project on the next decade of the UN Guiding Principles on business and human rights, where this issue, of course, is quite relevant. As this year marks the 10th anniversary of the Guiding Principles, or the UNGPs, the working group, who has a mandate from the member states of the UN Human Rights Council to promote the Guiding Principles. They are assessing the first 10 years of implementation and also developing recommendations for the next decade. And this assessment will be presented in what we call the stock-taking report to the Human Rights Council in June this year. And this again will be the basis for a roadmap for action for the next decade to be launched later in the year. Before I say a few words about voluntary action and the guiding principles and what's coming out of the stock taking on this topic, allow me to say a few words about the mandatory dimension of the UNGPs, which, of course, due to current developments, is getting a lot of attention also in the working groups stock taking, as the guiding principles establish that the corporate responsibility to respect to be put in practice through human rights due diligence and remediation is not an optional, of course, as you know, and the UNGPs also envisage mandatory measures by states, both at national and international levels, to be part of implementation. And it's, as Dora mentioned, in the definition of the smart mix of measures to drive implementation. And today we're seeing that this clarification brought by the UNGPs on the content and extent of corporate human rights due diligence is allowing progress towards regulation and legislation in various jurisdictions. And a key point from the stock taking is that persisting challenges and slow movement, in spite of what we're seeing now over the last decade, has underscored the point in the guiding principles that voluntary approaches alone are not enough, and I stress alone, and that the rise of mandatory measures will likely accelerate uptake and progress of human rights due diligence. But at the same time, experience of many decades shows that legal measures are essential, but not sufficient to ensure.
I think we just lost John. You're muted, Dorothy.
Sorry, I think I'm back.
John is back.
Coming back, so.
When it comes to the role of voluntary and collaborative efforts, and I realized what Dorothy is saying about the different types of initiatives, which I won't really have time to address, but in terms of such efforts overall, inputs to the stock taking have highlighted both limits and potential of such initiatives in terms of supporting effective UNGPs implementation. And as you know, the criticism is, especially from NGOs is clearly in relation to their role in supporting remediation and accountability, and that they cannot replace state action, of course, but where they can play a powerful role, of course, is as tools for learning, on due diligence, sharing of good practices, capacity building, and of course, what we've seen also over the last decade is the role of business-led initiatives and multi-stakeholder initiatives in helping raise awareness and reinforcing expectations to companies. And we also see they can help raise ambitions by integrating clear criteria based on the UNGPs. Specifically in relation to corporate human rights due diligence, they can provide a platform for multi-stakeholder dialogue and engagement, which in turn can support human rights due diligence. In this regard, global unions, for example, highlighting framework agreements as useful models for engagement. Another key challenge is a challenge that is coming out of the stock taking is the need for more and better data on how companies are implementing their responsibility to respect. And this is also an area where business and industry organizations and other collaborative initiatives can play a role in terms of supporting and developing better ways of measuring performance and supporting availability of data of data on implementation. So as the working group continues to work on the roadmap for the next decade, it will certainly be very useful to learn more about what has worked and what has not in the initiatives that we'll hear from today, and also, as you say, in how they can complement other efforts. So we look forward to the discussion today, and thanks again for the invitation.
Thank you so much, John. May I ask one super quick follow-up question, John? Namely, the question about the so-called safe harbor concern that many civil societies have as multi-stakeholder initiatives or collaborative initiatives generally are mentioned in human rights due diligence requirements at the national level as one way to fulfill human rights due diligence requirements. How does the working group stand on this point? I'd be curious to hear.
Yeah, actually on the question of safe harbor, I think that the working group is yet to develop a very detailed position. Okay. But of course, it's something they are looking at in the context of ongoing mandatory due diligence initiatives. So hopefully that's something they'll come up with clearer guidance on.
Okay, thank you so much. To be seen. So over to you, Davide. Thank you.
Thank you, Dorothee. Just going to quickly spotlight the different the members of the panel while we can all see them. For information for the attendees, you're all muted and your videos also don't work. That functionality doesn't work. We chose this setup to make it safer for everyone to join. So we try to avoid any Zoom bombings or similar events that have happened at previous, not events that we have run together, luckily yet, but we've heard of many colleagues and online events that have been disrupted by these Zoom bombings. So this is the only reason. It's not that we don't want to hear your voice or we definitely want to hear your opinion. So please use the chat function, use the Q&A to share your questions and comments with us. We'll try to address them as we go along during the panel or right after as well in the Q&A. So don't wait for the end of the session to pose your questions. Please use the chat and we'll try to address them. I would like to quickly show again who, well, the speakers are here. So Jan Wies representing Nestlé and André Podlesek representing Schindler here today. Risha Mittal representing the Fair Labor Association and Sarah Dekish representing the International Cocoa Initiative. So thank you all for joining us today. I'm looking really forward to this discussion. We have, for your rotation, we have prepared questions around 3 themes. We're not going through it in terms of a set agenda, but just also for the attendees to be aware and to navigate this discussion. We want to look first and foremost at reasons that companies have for engaging in these initiatives, or reasons for stakeholders to establish these type of initiatives. So that will be the first block will be around why engaging or establishing voluntary collaborative initiatives. The second block will be looking at the complementarity between voluntary initiatives and mandatory initiatives. So building on what we also just heard from John and from Dorothee in the introduction. And then last but not least, we want to see and explore in the discussion what are the success factors, what are kind of the elements that make a voluntary collaborative initiative successful? What are the factors that ensure that a voluntary initiative contributes in a meaningful way to advancing business respect for human rights? So we will try and find out what type of factors, what type of initiatives can play a positive and really contributing role and really complement mandatory human rights and diligence measures. Because as we heard from John, mandatory is probably necessary, but is also not enough to really advance corporate respect for human rights in a scalable way. With that, I would like to kick off the discussion right away. You should all be seeing the panelists. There will be no slides. This is a panel discussion. We kick off with the first question I would like to put to Jan. You work Nestlé. Nestlé is a member probably of many initiatives. What are the reasons for Nestlé to engage in voluntary initiatives on human rights? What is the motivation? What are you looking for?
Thank you, Davide, for the question. So thank you for the invitation and for convening this discussion that is much needed. There are 3 reasons that I can see as to why we join collective action initiatives and voluntary initiatives. Maybe there are more than that, but I would like to just focus on 3. The first one is that they help us deliver on our responsibility to respect human rights. So clearly, our engagement and membership with these organizations have helped us deliver on our human rights program. And I'll come back to that in a moment with a few examples. The second reason is because they help us scale our efforts either at the sectoral level or industry level, or at the national level, or even sometimes at the global level. So based on lessons learned or information, what works, what doesn't work, these initiatives as individual companies help us scale up innovative models, or actually drop what doesn't work. So they are really nice, effective, I would say, incubator of either innovative solutions or basically lessons learned. And the third one, and it's going to be more nuanced, because they should help us address some of the systematic issues that we face on the ground. And on this, it's a bit more nuanced, because I think collectively, all together, we are not where we should be on collective action. I think there are some really nice initiatives, some really good attempts when it comes to really working together on the ground to assess some of the systemic issues that we are confronted with. I think altogether, I'm looking at myself, including, we're not where we should be. And I'll come back to that in a moment as well. But before I go a bit deeper into these three elements, as Doro said, I mean, there are different forms of collaboration, right? And so, of course, there are the multi-stakeholder initiatives that Richa and Sarah will talk about. But there are also private sector business-led initiatives that we should, I think, also like consider as part of this discussion. And there are also like some form of collaboration that like a company can have with an NGO or non-profit organization that I would argue would also like fit in this kind of like definition, because it's actually like working together on the ground. I'm saying all this because all of them serve different purposes. I think Doro said that. And it really like depends on, as a company, what is your strategy, where you want to go, what are your objectives, that you're going actually to choose which ones of these organizations you want to work with. So that's at least the way that, you know, we see it as Nestlé. So we have created this ecosystem of organizations. Some of them are multi-stakeholder, other are private-led organizations. We have also like collaborations with more like individual companies or even like consultancies. But it really like comes back to like what you want to achieve, either like globally or in a specific area, let's say like in a specific supply chain, because the situations that we face as multinational companies are very different. And so the needs are different. And so, yes, there is a role for these collaborative initiatives. But as I said, there are different types of initiatives, and all of them serve different purposes. I'll just go back very quickly to my 3 points earlier, and I'll be brief. But basically, so they help us deliver on our responsibility to respect human rights. You know, like Richa and Sarah being here today, you know, with us are actually the proof points, if I may say, actually that, you know, we can actually make a big, significant difference on the ground by working with either the Fair Labor Association or the International Cocoa Initiative. And I'm not going to go here into the details, but we've made significant progress with the FLA in cocoa, West Africa, and hazelnuts in Turkey with hazelnuts, and with the ICI also like in cocoa and West Africa. That wouldn't have been possible without their collaboration. Clearly, I mean, they have played a role not only actually to help us implement our programs, but also like to help us accountable when it comes to international standards or expectations from external stakeholders. But to my second point, when I said that they help us scale up our efforts, I mean, I think, again, here, the FLA and ICI are proof points of like how we have been able to do that. I'm just going to take the example of the child labor monitoring and remediation system that we implemented back in 2011. Actually together with the FLA and ICI. And at the time, we were the only cocoa manufacturer implementing such a system. And now we have more than a dozen companies actually like implementing it, some of the major cocoa buyers. And this is impact not only in Nestlé supply chain, this is impact at scale, and not only like in the industry, this is impact at the national level. And I think this is worth considering the impact that, you know, we can have actually through these organizations. And I will leave the third point for my next session here, but that's a very important one because I really want to stress that point. I think, you know, there are some great things that are being done, very valuable collectively when it comes to like impact on the ground. There are more things that we should be able to do.
Thank you, Jan. Very, very good points. Very good to hear those reasons delivered there in 1, 2, 3. Very good. And I think we can build on those with the other speakers as well now. Andre, Schindler, I think we can say with some certainty, is not as much in the public eye, in the public interest as Nestlé would be. Some probably use Schindler almost every day in their elevators, but may not be aware that Schindler is actually behind it and carrying them up and down. But as a company that's not typically, you know, out there on stage and in the limelight, what is it for you that you're looking for in these initiatives? And I think it would be interesting to know what type of initiatives are you a member of and why?
Yeah, thanks a lot for the question, Davide. Actually, I have had this question also from other people asking me. Funnily enough, I was employed by Schindler specifically for the topic of sustainable supply chains 6 years ago. So it was already a topic in the company that said, we need someone that is working on this. And when I started working on it, I noticed the inside out perspective here is not helping, because you only see what you already know. So how can I get to the knowledge of what are the issues? What should we be working on? And that's why we then at that time were actually a founding member of the Responsible Sourcing Council, which is a cross-industry council, and we're discussing there more from a top-level perspective, what are the issues and how can we tackle them? And then we joined the two initiatives, one on the Swiss working group, Sustainable Supply Chains, which was organized by the Swiss UN Global Compact Charter, and also the international initiative Railsponsible, which is a railway initiative. But there again, we felt like we need this perspective also from slightly different actors, and we need this perspective from other countries, because even though we are a global company, we are very much, let's say, Swiss focused or focused on some markets, but we don't have this overview. So my conclusion here is I need this learning, what also Jan said, this learning as getting together and scaling also the efforts then, because if we see there are certain tools out there that help us in, for example, finding out where do we have issues, and then others in the group have an idea of how could we address that. And then a third one has the idea, how can we scale it up that it works for the whole supply chain? Because in companies like Schindler, where you have several 10,000s of suppliers, the topic is maybe different than if you're coming from a small company and you actually know every single supplier by name. So this was one reason for us to have this knowledge exchange, but especially also to then discuss potential solutions and discuss them in an environment where we are all together, where it's not, let's say, also not at danger of thinking about something and then finding out it doesn't work, but then you're already like publicly committed to it and then said, oh, now I need to get back. So that was the two reasons, or the three reasons for us.
Great, Andre. I think a very interesting point here about the sandboxing of ideas or solutions together with others. So thank you for those points. We've heard now from two companies why they're joining these initiatives. Risha, if I can move over to you, can you briefly describe what the Fair Labor Association is about, and why it was established, and how do you move or how do you advance corporate respect for human rights?
Sure, thanks, David, and very happy to be part of this panel. So just a little bit of background on the Fair Labor Association. We are a multi-stakeholder initiative. We have civil society organizations, US universities, about 100 of them, and global companies, about 50 very large companies in the food sector, also in the apparel and footwear, and surfboards, or sporting equipment. And what we do is we primarily work with these companies to raise standards. So companies work with us because they want to be leaders in promoting and protecting worker rights. The FLA provides very high normative standards, and we work with companies to set their sights on just not compliance and due diligence, but also on remediation. And taking concrete actions to bring fairness to all aspects of the workplace. So they adopt standards, they get support in implementing these standards, evaluating their progress, measuring the progress, and remediating. And what FLA does is we independently verify and validate what companies are doing in their supply chains, and we publicly report on them. So, when this term voluntary comes in, I have a little bit of a problem with that, because even if the membership into the FLA is voluntary, so companies come in, of course, they decide to do that, but after they come into the FLA, nothing is voluntary. They have to align their standards. They have to aim to achieve 100% traceability. They have to establish the human rights due diligence systems, and we publicly report on it. companies cannot pick and choose. They cannot pick, oh, I'm going to be part of this initiative or this project. So I think, when we parse out the whole, discussion around voluntary initiatives, so we have to think about just the membership is voluntary, but nothing after the membership is voluntary anymore. So that's I would like the audience to think about, when you think about the structure, the method, the standards, the activities, the accountability, the transparency frameworks. And I think those aspects provide a good terminology to think for Dorothy, for example, to think about, what do you put in the voluntary bucket? What do you put in, more MSI bucket sort of things? So also the last but not the least, I want to emphasize that FLA has been, we were established out of the White House task force. And the idea was to conduct independent due diligence on companies' program. And this was 20 years back. This was before any of the other regulatory, the mandatory regulatory HRDD frameworks were there, or even the soft laws, the UNGPs were not there. So I would say that it was these few pioneer MSIs, that kind of carved out the path for this kind of accountability and, companies coming together, having a safe space, but also, doing something about the issues that they found. And the work of all of these several initiatives actually informed the development of the UN guiding principles or the OECD guidelines, which now kind of form the backbone of mandatory human rights due diligence frameworks. So, from an FLA perspective, we definitely support the mandatory human rights due diligence. And I'll take a quick example. When we were starting to work on the cotton supply chains in 2006 and 7, or even with Nestle in 2011, these companies, stuck out their neck and said that we want to do this, we want to address the issue. Now, there was no mandatory human rights, framework to bring the laggards, with them. So I think the mandatory human rights due diligence provides a framework for those companies who either don't want to do it, or who have not thought about it, who do not have the vision to do it. So I think the mandatory human rights due diligence kind of drive a lot of these companies into the right direction, and what we call it increasing the tent. So I think the HRDD frameworks kind of increase the tent, but again, as many of the other panelists have said, it cannot be just having the regulatory framework is enough. You need organizations like the FLA and other initiatives to operationalize those and to work with companies on making progress.
Thank you, Risha. Very good points, actually, that will also lead us into the next, that we will pick up on again in the next block of questions. But before we do that, before we talk about complementarity, Sarah, you work at the International Cocoa Initiative. Can I ask you more or less the same question we asked Risha? What is the ICI about? Why was it established? And how do you kind of push that corporate respect for human rights forward?
Well, thank you, Davide, and happy to be here with another casquette this time in another role than the previous time. So indeed with the ICI. So ICI is a Switzerland-based foundation that works on advancing the elimination of child labor and forced labor in the cocoa sector. And we are indeed structured in a multi-stakeholder setting, which means that we work with members and partners, so industry, cocoa and chocolate companies, which are traders, processors, and chocolate makers like Touton, like Nestle, like Mondelez, Mars, Barry Callebaut, and others. Also industry, non-industry and civil society organizations, Save the Children, but also GAVU, which is an agricultural workers union of Ghana, to give some examples, and are also represented as board advisors, international institutions, the OHCHR, ILO, UNICEF, and also finally, although they are not members, because that's technically not possible, but we also work with governments, and mainly governments from cocoa producing countries, and especially Côte d'Ivoire and Ghana, where we are present. So that's to give you a short overview of ICI and how do we advance the respect for human rights. Well, so children's rights are human rights, and that's really our focus. And as I mentioned, we work with our members and partners to tackle child labor and forced labor in cocoa growing communities. And we do that through different approaches, 3 main approaches. One is offering operational, technical, capacity building support, as it was mentioned before. So we developed the child labor monitoring and remediation system, in short CLMRS. And actually, and Jan and Richard can probably confirm that, as Jan highlighted before a bit already, that was a tool developed upon demand actually from Nestle at the time, and based on recommendations from the FLA to really have a tool that helps to identify, prevent, address, and remediate child labor, and which is embedded in company supply chains. And this tool has since been implemented within cocoa supply chains in West Africa, also by other companies. So that's, if you will, a sort of an operational tool. We also provide trainings, being to suppliers, farmers, local communities, and governments. We also have community development programs, for example, on income generating activities, on quality education, and so forth. So that's one area. Another area is about advancing learning, and I agree with Andre, that's also an important part, so really knowledge sharing and innovation, learning from what is working well, understanding where gaps are, and most importantly, continuing to understand root causes and what to do about them in view to constantly strengthening our systems and our capacities. And then the third element, and that's an increasingly important one, is the supporting enabling environments. I usually don't like buzzwords, and that has become a little bit of a buzzword, but I think it says it all. And we believe that for all these efforts to be really impactful, and for actually human rights due diligence as such to be impactful, we need the right ecosystem to be in place. And that's why also we as an organization, we don't necessarily work in isolation with our members, but we work with others. And this is also why this multi-stakeholder setting is so important, because it gives us the legitimacy and the credibility to interact and work closely with all other stakeholders in the sector. And we'll probably come back to that later in the discussion. So maybe to say it in a short terms, you can imagine ICI as a sort of technical expert and a chef d'orchestre in the sectors. That's really what we are trying to do.
Great, thank you. Thank you for sharing the all 4 of you sharing the reasons, sharing the motivations for establishing these initiatives or joining these initiatives, and for sharing also how you work, especially Risha and Sarah, for sharing how you respond to some of the points that Jan and Andre raised as reasons for joining, and also adding some more on top of that. I think I'm looking back, for example, at a very interesting point that takes us into the second block of questions, which you raised, Risha, around going beyond compliance, raising the standards. I think they're already kind of this point of complementing mandatory. You mentioned many of these initiatives predate legislation in this space, so have laid some of the groundwork. They still continue to exist. So it's interesting now, I think, in the next block to speak about why do they continue to exist? Are they still important? So I think this is, I think, the core of this next set of questions. How can they complement? Do they complement, or have they outlived their time? Which I think we can get to the bottom of with this group, considering there's many countries adopting legislation. We see, for example, in the US, a lot being done also through customs with withhold release orders, so materials and products being blocked at the border if they are assumed to be or proven to be coming from forced labor. So we'll now try and dive into this space of how voluntary complements mandatory. I would like to start right away with you, Sarah, again. Quick question. thinking about all these legislative initiatives and developments that we've seen over the last few years, and these initiatives also becoming harder, so requiring reporting on one hand, and now increasingly also requiring actually due diligence to be carried out. Do you see a growing engagement from companies in the topic, but specifically also in ICI or in general in these initiatives? Do companies now search for spaces to learn how to address these requirements?
Yes, it's a good question, and well, maybe we still will have to see what comes out in the coming months. It's still maybe early, but indeed, I think that the current legislative developments certainly as a push factor, and they contribute to make the corporate respect for human rights agenda higher on everybody's mind, which in return results to also people putting more resources into it, etc., etc. But then still, you need to figure out how you do that in practice, and so that's also a bit our role as ICIs, to serve sort of as a bridge between the voluntary and now increasingly mandatory frameworks and the actual implementation on the ground in a way that that puts the focus and the cursor on our aim, which is to improve the lives of the rights holders, in our case the children, and not be merely a tool used as a sort of a tick box. Yes, I'm doing it, and that's the whole thing. So yes, well, it gives us the opportunity to continue to work with existing members and to improve, to constantly go further. We see indeed, again, I don't know if this trend will be verified over the medium and the long term, but we see more and more demand coming also from very small players. So that's certainly clear. Organizations are looking for support. And we do also see, I think, a growing engagement from all stakeholders, because in the end, again, we need all the players in the end have a responsibility. And if we want to succeed collectively, again, with what should be our end goal, again, in our case, to tackle child labor and forced labor, then I agree with Jan also that more alignment and coherence is needed. And so the legislative developments, I think, also reinforce the need for alignment and for an organization like ICI in this multi-stakeholder setting to use this neutrality to play a role of a conveyor among all the stakeholders. So continuing to work with governments, in our case in cocoa producing countries, so helping them in framing policies, action plans, national systems, working with governments in cocoa importing countries. And today, indeed, with all the discussions going on at EU level, there's a lot here to do as well, working with civil society organizations, as I mentioned, also to ensure alignment between efforts instead of having everyone trying to reinvent the wheel, and also working here on a common results framework to evaluate efforts in the sector and to understand how we again collectively can improve and can go further. So in that sense, yeah, it's I think it clearly brings more momentum, and it clearly also brings the collective responsibility quite high.
Thank you, Sarah. I don't know if any of the panelists want to respond to that question, or maybe to something that Sarah said. Rish, I see you unmuted yourself.
Yes, when you asked the question, I was thinking, like, are companies now rushing to get either consultants or trainers or truly MSIs or voluntary initiatives? So I think it still needs to be seen what companies would go for. And I think we have to be very, very careful, again, to the same point, parsing out what is okay and what is not okay. So I would say that, definitely the demand of, organizations helping companies would increase, but would a demand of organizations holding companies accountable will increase or not? We just don't know. It's yet to be seen. just from an FLA perspective, when I think about our multi-year accreditation process, what companies have to do or what we recognize companies to do. So they have to understand the linkages between business practices and workplace conditions in the supply chain. Second, they have to put effective systems in place to prevent abuses. And third, they commit to collaborating with suppliers. These are not easy things, so coming and getting a training done, okay, check box, but actually your CEO making the top level commitment and then operationalizing this last to Madagascar or to Cote d'Ivoire or to Cameroon is tough. So I think it still remains to be seen, of demand of which kind of organizations will increase, but we are hopeful that all sorts of organizations, the demand will increase. Lastly, what I also want to emphasize is I think we have to also think about, are there key areas, Sarah talked about these collective, collective roles. So I think, living wages, something, what companies are doing. So maybe that's, a particular topic we want to look at. Forced labor in Xinjiang, for example, FLA has put out a very strong advisory, banning our own members to not source from, banning from them to source from Xinjiang. So I think apart from these feel-good type of, activities, we also need to take some very, maybe uncomfortable, but really necessary actions. So again, my reaction to this is that demand will increase, but we have to be very careful on what type of organizations and what type of services.
Great point, Risha. And I think at the beginning of your intervention, you actually seeded here the question to the companies. So what demand will increase? So, but I saw that Andre raised his hand. I don't know if you wanted to comment as well.
Yes, I just wanted to quickly add to that one and agree with Risha. This is really key to have this perspective change. Because in the past, I have to admit from my learnings so far, companies are focused on risk management in this regard. Also in sustainability, this was the case for ages, so to say. And now suddenly we need to change this perspective from thinking about risk for the company to thinking about risk for the rights holders, thinking about risk of people getting hurt, so to say, if you go to the extreme. This is a completely different thinking. And this, I think, needs time, and it needs time to discuss this in a space where you feel safe to also speak about the issue that you have, that you don't have maybe this backing to address this. So this is one, this perspective change, that you suddenly understand it's not about me being caught, it's about somebody else getting hurt. That is the point what we are discussing, and to prevent that. And then to add what you said, Risha, in getting at the end the CEO to make the commitment and the company to work on it. But then next level is then also to collectively address topics that are much too big for one to address. You mentioned Xinjiang. These things are not something that one company could in the boardroom decide how to solve it. This is not what is happening there. So this is something where we need these initiatives that we come together, discuss a solution, discuss it also with maybe the local government there, discuss it with the people affected, and finding a way of what can we as companies do. Also in the sense of the UN guiding principles, our role is to respect human rights. It's not our role to protect them, but how can we work together here and make sure that it gets to the good for the people?
Thank you, Andre. Jan, I saw you nodding. Did you want to add something?
I always agree with Andre, so that's why I was nodding. But no, seriously, no, I think you're perfectly right, Andre. And I said before that like these collective action initiatives help us in our efforts to respect human rights, but they are by no means the solution, right? So they are one element, one tool of like our approach, but by themselves, they cannot like help companies discharge their responsibility to respect human rights. And I think this is a very important point. When I think it's fairer to actually like judge companies like individual companies than multi-stakeholder organizations or collective action initiatives. And this is because in my view, these initiatives are as good as their lowest performing member. So when you look at an organization, don't look at like who is leading in this organization. Look at like who is lagging, because basically it will tell us a lot as to like how strong this organization is, how serious they are about their membership, their accountability mechanisms, and how actually they push the agenda like among their membership. And I think this is something that is important to remember, because there are like very often, and I think this is the case for all the organizations that I know of, they are very often aligned on the lowest common denominator. And sometimes this lowest common denominator is very high. And I would say, this is the case for the FLA, but this is always like, like the denominator that everybody is okay with, right? Agrees, because they have chosen to join these organizations. But it's always like the one that everybody agrees with. And so sometimes, again, sometimes it's very high, and sometimes it's less high. But I think what really like makes an organization strong or less strong is, as I said, so the membership. So who is part of the organization? If there are companies that don't have like a strong human rights due diligence in place, and they are members of these organizations, well, certainly this organization is not really like strong itself. I think for me, it's always like a good indicator. It's also like about visions, and this vision can be like about setting standards, as the FLA does, about like setting an objective, as ICI does for itself. I mean, it depends. It doesn't have to be like one thing in particular, but the vision is important. What do we stand for? What do we all want to go for? And whether this vision is tangible and achievable. And it goes back also to reporting and transparency, which I said, like everything we do with member companies is public. And I can tell you, I mean, the FLA, they are tough. They are really tough. And this is basically why we chose to join them back in 2011, because the issue and the issues that we try to address with them are difficult, are complex. And so they require like a level of accountability, transparency, and engagement that is difficult to find elsewhere. So, again, I mean, it goes back to like what a company needs, what a company stands for, which kind of like organizations, this company needs to deliver on its own responsibility to respect and its own like objectives when it comes to this. And finally, and I'll leave it there because I want to keep this one for the last question, but I'm just like planting the seed here. But I think it's also like about the capacity of an organization to prove the kind of like impact it can have. So it's not all about reporting, so reporting on training, as Richard said, or reporting on this kind of like output indicator. It's about impact. Which kind of like impact the organization has been able to leverage through its members or as an organization. It's about impact, and it's about technical advocacy. And I think, Sarah, you said it by saying like, we try to advance the enabling environments. We call it like technical advocacy. And technical advocacy is very important because it's actually like going into political discussions and sometimes legal discussions, but based on science, based on knowledge, based on what works and what doesn't, not based on political considerations. And I'll come back to that in a moment, because I think this is a role that this collective action initiative should play more.
Thank you, Jan. And I think, again, there's a nice segue already happening into the success factors. We heard a few. I just wanted to take a second to see if there's any question that we need to address now or in the next bucket. Just give me a second. I think there was a comment from one of the participants. In the absence of effective protection of human rights by governments, business may face a moral duty to protect people from human rights abuses and to not look away. I don't know if anyone wants to respond to that comment, or if we just leave it there. Also later when we get back to Crispin and Dorothee, but if anyone wants to jump in now, we can do that. Otherwise, we can move to next one. Jan, you raised your hand.
I'm happy to take it, and I won't be long, but I think that's an important point. But it all goes back to this notion of collective action. When we say collective action, it's not only like companies, among themselves, or with civil society organizations, or even like with universities. It's also like with governments, and I will argue in a moment. It's also like with investors. So we need actually to think out of the box here. I think the way that multi-stakeholder initiative have been shaped in the last decade or so is I mean, you can find the kind of a similar membership, I would say, between them. But we need to think out of the box. Yes, governments need to be part of these collective actions. Or at least some of them, right? And especially when it comes to multi-stakeholder organizations. And I will leave I'll leave it there. But I think investors as well. And I have a very nice example that I would like to share with you after that. That shows the impact that investors can have when it comes to collective action. That's an untapped opportunity, I think.
Thank you, Jan. We have just 30 minutes left. I see a follow-on comment from one of the participants, but there was also a question that I think still fits here very quickly, mainly to Risha and Sarah, about criteria for working with companies or partnering with companies. Do you set a bar? I think it goes also back to Jan's point. These organizations have a common denominator. Where do you set a bar? How do you decide if you take on a company into your initiative or not?
Yes, it's a good question, and and Jan can definitely speak to it because he went through, they went through the whole application process. But just from an FLA perspective, we do, so in terms of the bar itself, the FLA has two standards. One we call the Principles of Fair Labor, which is a corporate governance level standards. That's 74 KPIs, and that's what we measure companies against. And another one is the Workplace Code of Conduct, which is based on ILO conventions, with which we look at working conditions at the factories and at the farms. Now, when a company comes into the FLA, what we really see is the commitment. So the CEO has to make that kind of commitment in order for, for a company to work. The second thing is, are they ready to invest resources? And I think that kind of flows, from there. We do not allow certain, sectors like tobacco or mining or, sectors which we know inherently, no matter how much you work, it's very difficult to work on it. So in a way, I think for us, the criteria is the CEO level commitment, the resources, having a due diligence program also is important. And in the first year or the second year of the program, we actually come to know how a company is performing. So it has happened, and we have different milestones to say, okay, if a company does not perform in this particular milestone and achieve this, then it needs to be escalated to the board, to consider or reconsider the membership. But the entrance level is really top level management commitment, resource allocation, and if they have some level of internal structure. But I think the program itself is so rigorous that if companies are not serious, they either drop out themselves or they are asked to leave by the board, and which has happened many times. Many large companies have actually dropped out of the FLA, but we don't name and shame. So the idea is not to run a campaign against them or to name and shame, because we understand that the standards are quite high, but companies who kind of stick with the FLA, I think they definitely need that kind of recognition that having worked with the FLA for 10 years, it means something, and still not getting publicly recognized. I mean, I don't know, Jan, if you want to comment on that.
Thank you, Risha. I see quite a few questions coming in. I'm just trying to see how we best address them. I think there was one question that came back from a participant that goes to the point you made, Risha, about voluntary initiatives being just voluntary and joining them. Everything else is then mandatory or required, right, to be in. And the question actually then, to build on that, that the participant asks is, how can companies be required to join voluntary initiatives? So that is a question, I don't know, maybe for thinking, or I don't know if anyone has a response already. But yeah, I think that's a very interesting question that we received here. Jan, you raised your hand right now.
Can I just address this one? And it comes from my good friend Frank. So, but I think this is the wrong question. Sorry, Frank, but I think this is the wrong question because again, I mean, you need to give like some flexibility to companies. And now, of course, you can judge as CSO, as a consumer, as a member of society at large. You can judge companies' human rights performance, of course. I mean, right? And you will have KPIs and criteria to do that. You will have benchmarks that do that for you even, but it needs to be seen as part of this approach to human rights due diligence. This either you join this organization or not, and you need to give this flexibility to companies based on who they are, what they stand for, what they want to promote, where they operate, how they are structured. So this flexibility is very important. I think we have legislations that look good overall, that are coming from like many different directions. They will actually like give more direction into like what company needs to do, and this is good as long as they provide this level playing field that we need. But then like how company actually deliver on these legal requirements needs really like to be built up, and this is like where companies like can really like tap into their resources, innovation, and way of doing things, even like way of doing business, to deliver on this. So obliging companies to join this or that organization, I think I don't think this is the right direction.
Yeah. And if I may just add very quickly, I think the mandatory human rights due diligence, again, cannot be just about enforcing against bad behavior, but it could be about rewarding good behavior and creating an environment where fair labor practices, are the norm. So in a way, rather than saying companies should join, but companies who are MSI members and who are doing the right thing could be recognized and given some sort of a credit and say that, okay, if a company has achieved accreditation of this particular organization, XYZ, 15 of these criteria, which the government requires, is already fulfilled, rather than doing the double work itself. So it doesn't have to be about negative, but also positive incentives to encourage companies to join.
Thank you, Risha. Good point. Sarah, maybe the last comment on this block before we move into the success factors. You raised your hand, Sarah?
Yes, indeed. Maybe just to add to what was said, and here I think ICI settings is a bit different to others, because we focus, well, we have as members companies from and organizations from the cocoa industry, so it's not well spread like for the FLA. So of course here anyone from the sector would be welcome to join. So here I think the criteria are a bit different. And actually in our case, by becoming a member, or the organizations we work with contribute to this collective journey. And the idea is really to bring impact for everyone, or for the sector collectively. So here I think it's a bit of a different approach. And as Risha mentioned, also the bringing the right incentives is key, and working on what is working well to bring the others to the same level is also key, I think, especially with the sectorial focus. And I wanted to say something else, but I forgot. But yeah, and one way to incentivize is also to allow for reporting, so setting targets and allow for reporting again collectively within a sectors. And then it's also a way for the leaders to inspire and motivate the less advanced ones to do more, and us as an organization to support wherever support is needed. So I guess there are also different forms of multi-stakeholder initiatives, or different form of voluntary initiatives, and different ways of incentivizing and driving the work within an initiative. And the whole challenge is to find the balance between, of course, being demanding and pushing all the actors while not being too prescriptive, because then you also take the risk to lose some on the way, and which is not the objective if you want again to reach this common goal.
Thank you, Sarah. We have 20 minutes left. We have one block to go through. We will continue addressing the questions and answers as we go, as opposed to having a block of questions and answers later. In the last block, I mean, we could speak for hours, I think. Next time, I think maybe the event has to be longer. In the last block, we want to look at some success factors. And I think we've heard quite a few already in the discussion, which is good. We can build on that. But I think now to just clarify and maybe just go through more clearly what success factors we believe make voluntary initiatives really meaningful in this agenda. The question, or the reason why we want to address this question, is, on the one hand, how can companies identify strong voluntary initiatives or strong initiatives to join, to really make sure that they join an organization that is ambitious and lives and breathes this ambition as well. And on the other hand, it's also for governments, for policymakers to be able to identify strong initiatives and decide, okay, we're going to support this type of initiatives or this type of initiative. We want initiatives that have ABC elements within them to ensure that they complement our legislation or a partner country's legislation or whatever it is. So I think it's really interesting to look at this question to be able to, for those two stakeholders to decide and where to chip in. And then, of course, also for consumers, NGOs, civil society to be able to say, okay, we can evaluate the strength of and the seriousness and the accountability and transparency. We can look at organizations and actually make up our mind about organizations that are strong and that really bring a contribution to the space, or less. So I think it's really interesting now if we can go through the little time we have left. We still want to do a little closing from with Dorothy and Crispin, but if you could maybe reiterate, underline some success factors. Andre, I would start with you. What would be, let's say, 3 elements you look for to say this is an organization that makes the cut?
Sorry, you were addressing to me, right? Good. Yeah, what we were looking at in the beginning was, I have to admit, a low entry barrier. We wanted to join that to see how does it work at all. Is it something where we find our way? Is it something where we can also then later commit to something like Risha said about the FLA? Once we are in, it's no longer voluntary, but we also need this, let's call it a sandbox where we can test out how far can we go. The second is what I think is very important, to find allies there that also have a value in your own company. What I mean is, if, like in Responsible, if we are talking to SBB and the railway, Deutsche Bahn, and so on, all these railway companies which are big players and which are, by the way, also our customers, it then later has a value if I go to my executives and tell them, look, we have discussed this and we found out this is extremely important. We should do more of that. That has more of a value than if sorry, Sarah, but if I say I talk to the Cocoa Initiative and then someone says, that is great, but we actually don't do anything with Cocoa. So I see the point there of having allies that speak also in your organization that have let's say, a value to them. And then later, maybe we could join or we could come together cross-sector and being much more broad. But first, I think for the entry point to have that awareness, it needs a relevance internally. And then third one, actually, what I think is very important is what was also touched by Jan, to find ways of having an impact. I find that is the most difficult job here. This is the most difficult part. How is it not just having so many hours of training or whatever audits you did? How can you actually come to something that has an impact and then also be able to see that impact and show it internally again, because that's your own, that's how you get your mandate to change something. You need that feedback and say, look, we did this one, it had an impact, and now let's do more of this. instead of doing something and then later finding out nothing changed. Why did we even do it in the first place? So it needs to be able to show that impact. And I found that easier if you are in a smaller group at the beginning, because then you can quicker come to conclusions. The lowest denominator might be something where you can be more challenging, because you can discuss this more tightly and say, why are we not doing this? We should do this more. Instead, if you're in a big industrial association, and then it is very difficult to come to a very high standard there. But I think entry barrier, finding a way of how to use that internally as a feedback, saying this is why we need to do it because customers are involved, whatever. And third is then to prove an impact, to prove something that happened here and do more of it.
Great points, Andre. Risha, do you want to add other factors to what Andre just shared?
Yeah, I mean, I'm interpreting this question in terms of, if the governments have to think about, which initiatives, what should they be looking at? So I do have 5 things, So the first is structure and governance. So is the governance system multi-stakeholder, are worker organizations representative properly? Just not as an advisor, but really getting into the policy discussion, the procedural, whatever standards are set, they are discussed, consulted, negotiated, and then set. So the structure and governance. Second is, of course, standard space. So everything that has to be embedded in the international conventions, guidelines, regulatory frameworks is extremely important. A process for independent validation and accountability. So this is, again, not a certification like, okay, I get the information from the website, I give a score to the company and that's okay, and that's certified. No, but what the company is reporting, you actually go behind, see the documentation, see how the company is doing. Are they making the connection between what their practices and the impact or on the ground? So really validating that is very important. Fourth, transparency. What we have seen is that transparency really drives change. And, if I take the example again, Nestle and Cocoa comes up again and again. Before, all these companies were working collectively and, aggregated reporting, unless, there's one report that comes out and say Nestle is doing this or not doing this in its supply chain, and Nestle making that public commitment. And that kind of drives change for a company, but also for the peers, because, again, the peers don't want to be left behind. And last but not the least, I think this role of complementary collaboration is very important. And if I just take, a couple of examples, and this is going back to Jan's point on remediation, I think, accountability is definitely important, but a big focus of the FLA is also to look at systemic, remediation to systemic issues. If a company could resolve things, they would have resolved it. They have the resources, they have the infrastructure. But the reason why companies struggle with issues is because the issues are systemic in nature. And unless they are resolved at a more collective level, you cannot progress. So what FLA is now trying to do is also focus a lot on remediation. And the 2 concrete examples I could give you is we looked at the hazelnut supply chains in Turkey with Nestle, Olam, Balsu, but then we saw that these issues are actually across many different commodities in Turkey. So even if you address issues on 6 weeks, for those workers, it doesn't address the issues for the rest of the 8 months. These seasonal migratory workers are working, across different commodities. So working with 8 companies, which are not necessarily FLA members, and 20 suppliers, and the government of Turkey, and 2 industry platforms, IDH, Sustainable Spices Initiative, and SAI platform, that's a complementary nature of remediation and impact. The second, which we are just starting, is with the Consumer Goods Forum. And this is more, and the Human Rights Coalition, which is on forced labor topic in Malaysia and palm oil. So FLA has the standards, the know-how, the expertise, and CGF has the right members and the leverage, the business leverage. So I think connecting those 2 is crucial and important, because FLA, we don't work with workers directly. We work through the company companies. So we need to work with the companies. So I think if these 5 factors governments can assess properly, that would make a good multi-stakeholder initiative or an initiative that can impact change.
Thank you, Risha. Jan, over to you.
Thank you, Davide. And I can only agree with Richa. I said before that they were a tough organization, but I meant it in a positive sense, because without them we wouldn't be where we are now. And you can argue that we could do more as a company on child labor. It doesn't prevent us from being criticized, but we know that we're having an impact, and we can show that through the work we do with ICI now and the reporting we do on a regular basis. And so we are very comfortable with that approach. So actually, interestingly, in our approach to human rights due diligence, the FLA and ICI play different roles, but very complementary ones. So ICI is more our implementing partner that we work with on the ground to really implement the system and scale it up at the industry level. The FLA is really there to verify that the system is effective, review it through audits, make recommendations, more than recommendations, actually make come up with the non-compliances that we need to respond to publicly. So I think it's really a good example of how 2 different organizations can be part of our overall approach to due diligence, become complementary, but with different ways of working and different purposes. But so this is one. So just to reiterate my point that it should be it is an important element. So collective action initiatives are an important element of a company's human rights approach, but cannot be the only one. It's just not credible. So that's my first point. The second is collective action. Richa explained what Harvesting the Future is in Turkey, big success. And we actually, it's the first time that we were approaching the issue of human rights from a workforce supply chain perspective. So not an ingredients, but really tracing the workers as they move actually within the country, and trying to see where they go and how we can partner with other companies where these workers work. And I think for me, this is very innovative, including with the way they work with the Ministry of Labor in Turkey. So including with the collaboration with the local governments. So collective action, how we can really enable collective action through these organizations is something that is key. I would just say again the importance of technical advocacy, and here I think ICI has played a critical role as part of the EU discussions on cocoa and child labor, because very often we tend to forget that very often regulators don't really know what they talk about, right? And because they have not been on the ground and they have not seen a cocoa plantation and they have never actually talked to a worker. And so it's good actually that we have this experience and we can actually just share this experience. Yes, it's difficult, it's complex, but we have seen that this is working and this is not working. So keep that in mind when you actually come up with regulations to make sure that they are that they have the impact that is expected, including from regulators. And finally, but I'll leave it there because I don't have the time to go through it in details. I will just post on the chat, an example that is called Rimba Collective. This is an initiative we launched 2 weeks ago, and it is innovative in many respects. Not alone because it also includes an impact investor that is actually gathering funding from different companies to address systemic issues. And I think here we also need to get inspired by what collective action initiatives do in other areas, including how they protect the environments, biodiversity, climate change. They are more advanced than us, I think. And I think they are a great deal of learning that we can take to apply it to some of the issues we face. I'm going to talk for Nestlé: living income in the upstream supply chain, access to education, responsible recruitment are big agenda items. And we need to come up with innovative ways of dealing with them. I think we'll go a great deal with the organizations that we currently have. But I truly believe that we need to really scale up our game here and come up with something that is a bit different, that builds on what we do already, but goes further.
Thank you, Jan. Sarah, I don't know, what do you want to add very, very quickly? Some successes maybe that we missed out on?
No, indeed, a lot has been said, and I agree on the remediation point. And this is actually where the multi-stakeholder setting comes in as well, because indeed, to tackle the issues addressed, you need to. It doesn't require one single solution. So this is where you need again to work with the local players, with the local government, with the companies, with everyone together to actually build also the infrastructure needed for the issue, which are usually grounded in many in a whole ecosystem to be addressed. So that's very important. So yeah, the operational capacity and also the need maybe to define clear roles, not only for the organization with itself and with its members, but also across organization. We see now a multiplication of initiatives, and actually it's very important that every initiative can also collaborate together, but also be clear on its own roles and responsibilities, and indeed create a complementarity where it's needed. I think that's also very important, instead of everyone just reinventing the wheel, just finding alignment also across initiatives. I think that's also very important. And indeed, I agree on the importance to set targets and report transparently. Of course, then you take the risk to be criticized in case not everything is met as it was defined. But I think this risk has to be taken, and this is how you also bring again everyone always to further. So yeah, I think that's were some of the points I wanted to add or stress.
Thank you, Sarah. We're getting to the end of the time. We have 3 minutes left. We have quite some comments or questions still in the Q&A. We won't be able to address them right now. Some of them we'll try to address in the follow-up. Otherwise, I think some of them have been addressed in the discussion. So there was, just for again, transparency's sake, someone asked about how companies deal with competition considerations when collaborating sectorally on human rights. A question that we also get at WBCSD for the human rights work, but also other work. Definitely something that I'm sure the companies here, but as well as the initiatives, will be able to respond to. So we'll try to put something together there. I see there was a question about how impact is defined internally. I think we can, based on what we heard, really say it's not just about the business, but really also about the impact on communities, the impact on human rights, or like the prevention of negative impacts and the mitigation of negative impacts on people, as the definition also requires it, as the UNGP is also promoted. I think we addressed that in the discussion. There were some very, very particular or like very detailed questions. We'll try and see if we can address them in the follow-up. But to finish on time, I would like to thank Jan, Risha, Sarah, Andre for your insights, for your time, for your expertise, for the engaging discussion, and would like to hand back to Dorothee to close off. And I would like to thank the 100+ participants that joined us today for this 90-minute discussion that felt like way too little. But I think it's the limit of where we can go right now with these online things. Dorothee, over to you, and thank you all very much for your insights and your expertise.
Thanks, Davide. And I joined Davide in thanking all contributors today, my colleagues and the panelists. I kept nodding along while we were discussing. The fact that it always feels like we not have enough time, I think is a good sign that this was a rich and informative conversation. And certainly, these collective initiatives have been created because of a practical need. And just because we now have mandatory human rights due diligence requirements emerging in Europe, I don't think that their value is diminished. On the contrary, from what we heard today, I would say that they're still so needed to make human rights due diligence operational in different industry contexts. And I think we should avoid sweeping dismissals of so-called voluntary initiatives, but at the same time, we also need to avoid sweeping approval. And I absolutely love the criteria that Richa introduced for what makes a strong and a good MSI. I think we should build on that, and that could be informative for policymakers, but also for companies that are currently thinking about joining an initiative to distinguish between the ones that deliver and the ones that promise. So thank you very much, everyone, and have a good rest of the afternoon. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you all.
Thank you.